LBC Book Club. This week I'm joined by two fantastic authors. Peter Hain. I nearly called you Peter Mandela there.
Peter, I hope not.
Peter Hain is the former cabinet minister, and he's written a book about Nelson Mandela. It's not really a biography, but it really does enable you to get to know more about Nelson Mandela's life. Lots and lots of pictures in it. It's quite a small format book. It's $12.99 in hardback. It's published by Spruce Publishing. And our second guest in this hour is Toby Harnden. He's the US editor of the Daily Telegraph. He's written an absolute doorstop of a book here called Dead Men Risen, The Welsh Guards and the Real Story of Britain's War in Afghanistan. I say it's very good value for money at $18.99, because let's see how many pages it is. It must be 500 and
610.
610 pages. Well, you don't get much better value than that.
Well, £6.50, that's pretty good value. That's what the MOD paid.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute. Well, welcome to the programme, both of you. Now, if you've got a question that you'd like to ask either of the authors in the studio during the course of the next hour, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850, email ian@lbc.co.uk, or tweet us at lbc973. Toby, let's start with you, because you alluded to the fact that this book is slightly controversial. You were supposed to have been a guest on the programme a couple of weeks ago.
That's right.
But had to pull out. Just take us through why you had to pull out.
Well, it was all pretty surreal. The book was, authorised, or I signed a contract to get access to the Welsh Guards 18 months or so ago. And clearly, I had to have MOD cooperation to get out to Helmand and be with them. And the quid pro quo for me getting access was that I gave them the manuscript, and that they checked it for operational security and accuracy, which, I was more than a little bit nervous about it, because those can be sort of catch-all terms. Submitted the manuscript back in September. It went through a very long and tortuous process, 4-month review. I think I counted up 493 requests for changes or points or issues they had with it. We dealt with them. Some of them I accepted, many of them I didn't, and they signed the book off.
And were you free not to accept them? I mean, that was your decision in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on issues of national security, they could have issued a denotice. They could have gone to the denotice committee. There were some things they really dug their heels in on, and other things they didn't, and kind of vice versa. So it was a kind of a give and take process, if you like. I wasn't completely happy with some of the things I had to take out. They weren't completely happy with some of the things that were left in, but we reached a conclusion, I thought. And then 2 weeks after it had been signed off, I got a call saying, the books have come in from the warehouse from Quercus. It's a very handsome volume, etc., etc. And then almost simultaneously, we got a call from the MOD saying, Houston, we have a problem. And at that point, the problem was, bizarrely as it may sound, the Estonian government. There was an Estonian...
Isn't it always?
I know, the Estonians. Those tricky little Baltic states. And, it seemed preposterous, but they were saying there's an Estonian election coming up on March the 6th, all terribly embarrassing. Can you help us out? We're afraid the Estonians, who I think have 165 troops in Helmand Company, we're afraid that they're going to put out of Helmand and be terribly embarrassing. And so we sort of said, well, okay, we'll think about it. Well, let's talk. And then they hit us with security. And, we're not going to pay for any of it. We're going to take out an injunction. You're in big trouble. You have to destroy these books. And it sort of went from there. And 2 weeks...
Publisher's nightmare.
Publisher's nightmare, author's nightmare. And it took two weeks. And then we came out with the result of the MOD buying 24,000 copy print run. Reportedly, that was the number in the first print run, for 151,000 and £450, which is, taxpayer, as you've pointed out in your blog, it's taxpayers' money, and that's not a matter to be made light of.
Peter, have you ever come across this sort of thing before?
No, I'm pretty astonished at the story. I have come across the situation where former government ministers, cabinet ministers, have to submit to the cabinet office their if they're writing about their time in government, and sometimes that involves tweaks and changes and edits and cuts and so on, and a bit of negotiation. But this business of actually shelling out to suppress the book by buying it up is extraordinary. Presumably they're asking for changes which are now being made, so it'll go back on sale.
Yeah, it's on sale. I mean, it's in some bookshops today. I mean, but again, the changes amounted to about 50 words, and you will be really hard pressed to notice the difference between the two books.
I mean, on the face of it, and I don't want to harp on. I mean, I want to get into the content of the book, and I don't want to harp on about this, but it is a scandal actually that they should spend that amount of money, I think.
Well, especially when they're giving redundancy notices to people serving on the front line.
Yeah.
And by email, some of them, in serving in action. So then to have this money wasted on...
But I suppose on the bright side, it gives Toby a bestseller before the books even hit the bookshops.
Well, absolutely. He didn't contrive this, Toby, did he?
Do you still get
Certainly
royalties
not.
on those copies?
A bestseller with one buyer. They didn't buy it from Amazon or bookshops. It didn't count on the bestseller charts.
Oh well, never mind. So you don't get royalties on those.
Afraid not.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. What gave you the idea of doing this book?
Well, Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thorneloe, who was the commanding officer of the Welsh Guards in 2009, had been a friend of mine dating back to Northern Ireland days when I was the island correspondent for the Telegraph in the late 90s, and he was a military intelligence officer working in South Armagh. And we met and became good friends. Rupert actually was always very discreet, and he was pretty light on the information he would give me. But he got me thinking about South Armagh and the family networks, the fact that the sniper teams operating there, there was all the bombs from London emanated from there, and he really sort of gave me this sort of spark of an idea about the place. I ended up writing a book called Bandit Country. And Rupert, although he was never named in it and never quoted in it, and there's very little hard information in it from him, he was a big part in that. So we were pretty good friends. And time went on. He got divorced. I moved to the States, and we, rather lost touch. And we would sort of say hello, emails, and it was pretty distant. But we kind of knew our paths, or thought we knew our paths would cross again. I knew he'd gone out to Helmand, and I was following the story, and then 1st of July 2009 Rupert was killed by an IED on the Shamlan Canal, and like everyone else I was like, oh my god, you two young children, just terrible. I was commiserating with his parents and with mutual friends, and in the sort of weeks that followed, people started saying, well, you know what, I think there's a pretty interesting story here. Rupert was destined right for the top. He'd been military assistant in the Ministry of Defence to Des Brown, the Defence Secretary. He was very charismatic and well-loved commanding officer. They've lost a platoon commander, a company commander, and now a commanding officer. There's a tale to be told, and so it just went from there. I also knew Rupert's successor as commanding officer, Charlie Antelm, who was promoted from major, pulled out of a job in the Ministry of Defence and sent out there. I'd been embedded with the Welsh Guards in Iraq in 2004, and I met Charlie Antelm then. So there was a sort of, it felt like there was a bit of a hand of fate in this. And so I went out to Helmand, and sure enough, there was a very good story there.
What fascinates me is it is a big book, and you've got your day job as US editor of the Telegraph. How do you get the knowledge to write 600 pages about this story? Because did you just go to Helmand once, or how did you actually get the information?
I ended up going to Afghanistan 3 times, but I was there for a month with the Welsh Guards. Well, I guess I'd had some background. I was in the Navy, so I had services background. Spent a lot of time covering the army, and counterinsurgency is what it's called now, I guess, in Northern Ireland. A lot of time embedded in Iraq with the American military and with the British as well. So I guess I did have a sort of a decent sort of military background. I'd been to Afghanistan in 2006 before the British arrived, so I had reported from there. But yeah, it was tough, and occasionally, I must confess that there's not too many senior Telegraph executives listening. The day job did take a little bit of a of a back seat, and hopefully...
Actually, your editor does listen to the programme, he told me, so bad luck.
Well, I think, there's a bit of my paying back now with a decent serialisation and a few news stories on the back of the MOD. But it was challenging. I did a lot of juggling. We also have 2 young kids. So a lot of time over here, on holidays and stuff, and in Wales, in Aldershot, interviewing soldiers and just going through it all meticulously.
Now, on the cover of the book, it says, "This book will unnerve politicians and generals alike." Do you think it will, or don't you think that Afghanistan's become a little bit of a forgotten war amongst many people in this country?
Well, I think that's certainly true, but what's also true, and I didn't think it was going to be quite as true as it has been when I wrote those words on the dust jacket. I mean, we've already had 2 generals, the Chief of the Defence Staff and the Chief of the General Staff, General David Richards and General Peter Wolfe, phoning me up, begging me to pull the book and stop the book. I think we've had Liam Fox in a pretty big rage over what's gone on with this book. And, I think underneath all this, there's the Estonians, there's the so-called security issues, there's all the other issues they sort of flung into the mix. But ultimately, I think they really didn't like this book. I mean, they realised very late on that it was embarrassing. Rupert Thornlow being very critical. He believed in the mission, extremely loyal guy to the army, but he had complained and, made his case again and again that there weren't enough helicopters, that the system for the helicopters wasn't right. They didn't have the right counter-ID equipment. They didn't have enough men. He thought the British strategy was flawed with a big operation every 6 months. He was a big sceptic on Panther's Claw, that big operation in the summer of 2009, and all that comes through in the book. So, I mean, I think it was a pretty fair comment to say that generals and politicians will be unnerved by it.
Well, we'll continue to talk to Toby in just a moment, and also talk to Peter Hain about his book on Nelson Mandela. 0845 6060 973 if you'd like to ask either of them a question. The time now is 9:15. And here's Alan Joyce with the travel.
Thanks, Ian. Still disruption tonight.
.co.uk/podcasts.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and with me in the studio are Toby Harnden, author of Dead Men Risen, and Peter Hain, who's written a book called Mandela. Peter, we were just talking about Toby's book there. If you had still been in government now, would you have been throwing 40 fits at the fact that this book was coming out?
I hope not, though if I can't really claim that the MOD might not have acted the same way, because it isn't a department that is in tune with the modern world in some ways. And that's been my experience of it. I'm not knocking people on the front line, of course I'm not. I've got many constituents who are active in service in Afghanistan, so it's not about that. It's about just, this is a great lumbering bureaucracy, and that's, I think, probably how this came, without knowing a lot about it. That's how that came to happen.
Right, let's start talking about your book. Nelson Mandela is a bit of a hero figure for you, isn't he?
He is, but the reason I wrote the book, or was asked to write it, is there's lots of books on him, including his own Long Walk to Freedom, but they're all about 800 pages. They're all fine books in their own way, but they're not the kind of books that the average person will pick up and read, either if they're on a long train journey or a plane journey or a
See, I've got
holiday.
That book on my shelf and I've never read it because it's 800 pages long.
And so many people say that to me. And yet so many people admire him and just want to know his story. So I've just told the story. I mean, I won't have an argument with you about whether it's a biography or not. I think it is. But it's a story that tells it from, his childhood as a herd boy in this poverty-stricken part of South Africa, and then and for many years of his life, well into his 20s, is not political at all. And then it becomes increasingly politicised, and we know what happened. But it is a fascinating story, and above all, I've tried to tell it in a readable way that, as I say, people can just pick up and know all about him without having to know, millions of pages of detail.
Well, in the introduction, you say, I was not as an impartial observer in his life, but rather an active participant, initially as an anti-apartheid activist, and then as a British politician and friend. Do you find it difficult to write a book like this about something that you clearly revere, but he's not an infallible character. I mean, there will have been negative things in his life that you have to discuss. How did you remain at least partially objective?
Well, ultimately, it's for the readers to decide, but I think most people who have read it say that that is the case, that I've just told it as it is. I've not pretended that I'm offering any, fantastically new primary sort of research that has unearthed some amazing new fact about him. But, it is unusual, I suppose, in this way that my parents were South African born. I spent my childhood in South Africa. They were jailed and banned, and I knew about him at a very early age because our home was raided by the security police, and my parents actually took food parcels to him in one of his trials at the end of the 1950s in the lunch hours. And then my mother would go along to his trial in 1963, where she was usually the only white spectator in the public gallery reserved for whites, and they'd exchange sort of greetings and salutes. Him from the dock, her from the public gallery. And there's one incident which I always really burnt into my psyche, which was my little sisters, who in their school uniforms were taken along by my mother after school one day and introduced to Mandela's beautiful, vivacious wife, Winnie. And she bent down to kiss the little white girls, and this horrified the white security police with their machine guns, who just totally disgusted and thought it was obscene. But then that was what apartheid was about in those days.
Can you remember your first realisation of apartheid as a child growing up in South Africa?
The fact that we had black friends in our house, that none of my white schoolboy friends, with whom I got on very well playing football and rugby and cricket and so on, being sports mad as I still am today, and then realised that we were different. My parents were starting to get notorious, so I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find my bedroom full of security police officers looking for things, as you do, looking for things that weren't there. And
it's a bit like Toby Hardenden's about to experience.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I hope not, Toby. Certainly not apartheid police. Yeah. But Mandela himself was somebody who, I was a young boy, and then in my early teens in my life there. So I wasn't a political sophisticate, but it was part of my blood, part of the family. And he was then imprisoned at that time, just before we had to leave, and remained very much a figurehead of the anti-apartheid struggle, albeit in those long 27 years of the prime of his life behind bars.
You then came to this country, and I guess first came to notoriety for protesting about the apartheid regime in this country. How did you get involved in the anti-apartheid movement?
Well, those particular protests, which I found myself leading at the age of 19, were against the all-white South African Springbok tour, because South African players of a different colour skin, like Brian Habana, the legendary South African Springbok winger at the moment, who's black, would not have been able to play at that time because the team was selected on race, kind of master race type of selection. And I took a front at this, and I decided to use direct action tactics, which are very much, the flavour of the month amongst radical politicians and the youth movement, student sit-ins, the Paris Revolt, those kind of tactics. And so we interrupted the matches, and I decided to apply those to the anti-apartheid struggle. And we stopped the Springboks playing effectively in the 25 matches that they played in 1969-70, to the point where the planned cricket tour of the summer of 1970 had to be stopped. And Nelson Mandela, when he came out of prison and came over to Britain, by then I was a Labour Member of Parliament in 1991, he told me that those protests were absolutely inspirational because they were subject to a news blackout. And they were the only things that they heard about from their absolutely furious and frustrated white warders who were Springbok fanatics, and then took it out on Mandela and his comrades in their freezing cells on Robben Island to complain about these demonstrations, not knowing that they were communicating a vital piece of morale-boosting information.
And how did Mandela become such a prominent figure in the ANC?
Well, as he became involved in the 1950s, his natural abilities rose to the fore, and he showed a lot of leadership, a lot of courage, and a lot of foresight. But he went into prison, and this is the most interesting thing I found researching the book, and I hadn't quite understood this. He went into prison as a burly freedom fighter, the touch of arrogance, and he had a reputation of a man about town in the 1950s in Johannesburg, the thriving metropolis of South Africa. And he gained in prison a kind of wisdom, initially to understand and relate to his white warders, who were badly educated, prejudiced, very aggressive, very violent to every other prisoner on the island except him. And he formed a kind of mutually respected relationship, understanding that the Afrikaner people had themselves being oppressed by the British. The Boer Wars, the first concentration camps were actually in South Africa during the Boer Wars at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And they sort of suffered an historic grievance, and they took power after the Second World War, and then, as it were, started to entrench themselves through apartheid. And he started to understand that, and that gave him the insight that he subsequently was able to put to good effect when the South African government eventually came to him in the 1980s to negotiate not just his own release, but the freedom of his people, and he was able to speak fluent Afrikaans to them, which they respected, to talk about their culture and their history, and to identify with them as fellow Africans. And that gave them the kind of confidence that enabled them to make the miraculous transformation that eventually occurred.
And just very quickly describe how he actually came to be in prison.
He was imprisoned because he decided, having exhausted all non-violent methods, initially legal methods, then non-violent direct action methods, strikes, stay-at-home, bus boycotts, and so on. That having been exhausted as a tactic in over 10 years, the ANC, his organisation, the African National Congress, having been banned and virtually all opposition suppressed, himself having been issued with a banning order and subject to repeated threats of imprisonment, he felt there was no alternative but to adopt guerrilla strategy, kind of like the French partisans in the resistance, the French resistance in the Second World War against the Nazis. He explicitly rejected terrorism of the sort we see today, whether it was from the IRA or from Al-Qaeda. But he said the only way to liberate his people was to conduct an underground struggle. That meant he went underground. He was eventually caught and sentenced to life imprisonment, narrowly escaping the death penalty. And it's an interesting historical point as to why he was reprieved.
That would have been that's an interesting counterfactual, isn't it?
Yes.
What if he had?
If they had the judge, presumably in consultation with the government, though then it's never been shown, had the ability to execute him. Many people were being executed. We had a good friend hanged by the neck, and they could have done that to Mandela, but they chose not to. They chose to give him life imprisonment, which at the time it was issued meant life, and of course, in the end, it didn't.
Well, we'll continue talking about Peter Hain's book on Mandela, and also Toby Hardenden's book, Dead Men Risen, The Welsh Guards and the Real Story of Britain's War in Afghanistan, which is published by Quercus at 18.99. I keep mentioning the massive 600 pages. That may stay on my bookshelf for some time as well, Toby. I have to warn you.
I'm worried about it being a little bit intimidating looking, actually.
It is quite it's not the first time you've seen it, I presume.
No, it's not. No.
Right, this is LBC 97.3. You're listening to the LBC Book Club. The time now is 9:30. And coming up at 10 o'clock, it's Clive Bull. He's here with me to tell you what is in his programme tonight. Hi, Clive.
Hi, Ian. Yes, I'll be here at 10. And, well, I heard you earlier talking about the countdown starting, this giant clock that's in Trafalgar Square. 500 days to the Olympics. It's a bit of an artificial thing in a way, 500 days, but nevertheless, they're trying to whip up the excitement. And
have you been down to have a look at it?
I was quite tempted, but I haven't, to be completely honest. It'll be there for 500 days, so, I've got plenty of time to go and see it, really. But I'd like to just test the water and see whether the apparent negative attitude that's been over the last year or two maybe is beginning to change and people are beginning to get more enthusiastic. I mean, certainly judging by the interest in tickets, it would appear there might be more enthusiasm. So I want to find out whether you've been signing up for tickets. There's going to be one massive bundle for those tickets as from tomorrow. We're also going to talk about men going to the doctors or not going to the doctors, more to the point, and why we are... we have a completely different attitude to our health compared to women, and there may be various reasons for that.
Do you know, just on that, as you know, we have a medical hour on the programme every Tuesday at 9 o'clock when we have a GP in the studio, and I am constantly amazed at the number of people who ring in and tell him quite personal things on sort of national radio, and you think, well, why haven't you been to your own doctor about this?
Yes.
And it's astonishing. And
they say, oh, no, I don't want to.
No.
Yeah, I don't like to.
We had a very interesting one last week, somebody, should we say, with a bottom problem.
Oh, yes.
But he'd had it for 10 years and hadn't gone to see his GP.
Mm. I was just having my tea at the time.
Were you?
Yeah, thanks for that.
You managed to sort it out on air.
We did, yes.
So we're going to talk about why men don't go to seek medical help, and we're also going to ask the people of Clapham whether they want a giant campsite on Clapham Common for the royal wedding. So all that and more coming up after 10.
We look forward to it, Clive. But you're now listening to the LBC Book Hour for the next 25 minutes. I'm with Toby Harnden, the author of Dead Men Risen, The Welsh Guards and the Real Story of Britain's War in Afghanistan, and Peter Hain, who's written a book simply called Mandela. It's a nice little hardback, $12.99. We were talking, Peter, just before the news about how Nelson Mandela ended up in prison. And I think all of us will remember the day that he emerged from prison. You can probably tell me the exact date. I can't remember what it is.
It's February 1990.
So you passed the test. Well, no, you didn't quite. Didn't give me the day. But it was one of the most amazing moments, really. And I think even people who had been rather sceptical about what he might achieve when he came out, I mean, it was a momentous day, I think, for everybody.
It was, to see him walking out of prison. A burly freedom fighter had gone in, and a dignified old African gentleman came out and really sort of captivated the world. I remember the press conference he gave the next day. He'd never actually engaged with television. He'd only seen television in the last few years of his imprisonment, when they'd allowed him to have one and they'd relaxed his conditions. And there he came out and just enchanted and dominated a press conference with the hard-bitten journalists of the world there in Archbishop Desmond Tutu's garden in Cape Town. So it was, and in a way, without romanticising it, actually, people forget that more people died than at any time in the history of apartheid between Nelson Mandela's release and him becoming president. There were just more killings, mainly by the state seeking to, as it were, they'd released him, but they still thought they could keep power. But the change was nevertheless miraculous, given where...
And it was quick.
It was relatively quick. I mean, there were fraught negotiations between his release and his eventual, the first ever South African Democratic general election. But, you know, given how brutal apartheid had been, what a tyranny it had been, and how much those exercising the power had to lose by giving it up, it is remarkable that the transition was accomplished pretty peacefully, relatively speaking, and pretty consensually. And I do think, and I argue in the book, that Mandela was crucial to that. He gave whites the confidence, particularly white rulers who had to deal with him, and then the white population had seen him as a kind of terrorist ogre, his reputation growing in sort of almost devil incarnate terms the longer he was in prison, and that they were then able to adjust to him running their country and being their president, and coming to accept that and to respect it, which is quite an amazing turnaround. I
mean, I don't profess to be an expert on this period at all, but I often think that F.W. de Klerk doesn't get the recognition that he probably deserves for bringing this about either.
No, he does deserve credit for it. I mean, he was an apartheid cabinet minister. He was schooled in the old National Party as an apartheid politician, but he came to realise that its time was up,
And when did he come to realise that? What triggered it, or was it just a gradual evolutionary process?
Well, you had a series of forces building up almost unstoppably. The economy was going into crisis because of all sorts of reasons: shortage of international finance, the internal eruptions in the townships, despite the police state apparatus, were growing. And de Klerk, when he came to power, nobody thought he'd be the great reformer, the great liberator. There's nothing in his background that gave any influence in. And I actually met him for the first time last year, and he told me that really he realised that this was it. Either the country fell over into dreadful civil war, or he had to change. And he found in Mandela somebody he could do business with. Now, you might have found, if it had been a Mugabe in that position, he wouldn't have been able to do business with him. So I think, and if it had been other African leaders, maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But Mandela these were two people. People say history is made by bigger forces than it is, but actually you do need individuals to be able to make the difference at the moment. And certainly Nelson Mandela was one of those.
And he's become viewed, I think, by virtually everybody as this sainted figure, and that he just oozes serenity. You can almost imagine him placing his hands on people and almost curing them of things. He's got that sort of aura about him. But even saints have flaws, don't they?
Yes, and he has them, particularly in his youth. And one of the tragedies of Nelson Mandela, which isn't much understood, but I bring out in the book, is that basically his family life was sacrificed with very serious consequences for his wife, Winnie, who strayed badly off the path that she was on when he left him. By the end, his daughters were babies when he went into prison, and they were adults when he came out. So he was not able to really support his family. But one of the things about him when you meet him, and whenever I've been with him, is there are very few leaders, and I've met a lot of presidents and kings and queens and prime ministers in my time, especially in government. I've not ever come across anybody like him who manages to still be a people's person. Because when you get to those pressures of a celebrity and so on, and the clutching of the crowd and the pressures of that sort of status, that people sort of stop having touch with the average citizen. And I've been with Mandela when he's held up Tony Blair, for example, who I was escorting in to meet him as Prime Minister, because he was chatting for ages to cleaners and porters and waiters and waitresses queuing up in the hotel in which we were, where we were at the time, to see him and talk to him. And there was I quote an example just to illustrate this in the book, where he asked after my mother when I was taking him in the same moment to see the Prime Minister, and he asked how she was, and I said, "Oh, well, she's actually broken her leg. She's in hospital." He said, "I must speak to her." So he got out of the lift. I had to get my mobile phone, track down the hospital, find the ward. I didn't know any of these numbers. Finally, get her to come to this, and I said to her, "Mum, there's an important person to speak to." He comes on the line. He says, "This is Mandela from South Africa. Do you know who I am?"
Did you think it was a practical joke?
And that's, it's typical Nelson Mandela.
And he had a very close relationship with Gordon Brown, didn't he?
He did, yes, and with Tony Blair,
does.
but he kept in close touch with both of them, and regularly would phone Tony Blair. But yes, he did. And Gordon Brown was actually always involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the Stop the Tour campaign, as it happened in Scotland. So yes, he had a long association with the anti-apartheid struggle.
And am I right in thinking he actually got on quite well with Margaret Thatcher, who a lot of people in the 1980s criticised for her attitude to the South African regime, but he didn't have any bitterness towards that at all when he met her.
He didn't. I mean, she'd only years before denounced him as a terrorist and said she wouldn't negotiate or deal with
I can
the
remember
ANC.
when I was in the Federation of Conservative Students back in the mid-80s, I mean, they seriously had T-shirts with Hang Nelson Mandela on them. I have to tell you, Peter, that I never wore one.
Oh, good.
I never actually saw one, but they did exist.
Oh, no, I remember going to meetings at universities when they would be branded, heckling me and wearing these badges and shouting out, "Hang Nelson Mandela." But you see, that's his great sort of characteristic as a person, he didn't show any bitterness to his prosecutors, his jailers, his oppressors, the people who, oppressed his people and himself. And for Margaret Thatcher, well, he was part in that healing mode when he met her. I always remember when he came to address Parliament at a great event in the in Westminster Hall, and she scurried down the aisle to be right on the front for his address to
she always
join
knew
Parliament.
A good photo opportunity.
I thought there was an irony
one,
about that, but he didn't mind.
Was his personality always like that, or was that something that developed as a result of jail, do you think?
I think it developed more in jail, because he, in the 1950s, he was seen as a respected guerrilla leader in the 1950s, and ANC leader, and very charismatic as he increasingly became. But I don't think he had that self-deprecating sense and mischievous sense of... he's a great mischief maker when you're with him. He's always pulling his own leg and pulling everybody else's leg. I remember when I introduced my wife to him in 2003 in London, and he said... he said to her, "So you finally trapped him then, did you?" Now, Elizabeth's quite a strong, independently minded woman, so she didn't take very kindly to this, but because it was Nelson Mandela, she
what do you say?
I don't think he was like that before he went into prison, as far as I can discern from researching. But I think he became like that much more. He had a sort of a wisdom.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Toby Harnden, author of Dead Men Risen, and Peter Hain. Again, I nearly called you Peter Mandela, which is you must take as a compliment. Peter Hain, who's written a book about Nelson Mandela. The time now is 9:45. And it's time for The Travel with Alan Joyce.
Thanks, Ian. A Chiltern Railway still reporting.
Night from 10.
Now, I did promise to tell you earlier who would be sitting in for me next Tuesday, because I'm off on one of my Evening with Anne Widdicombe evenings in Winchester, believe it or not. Alistair Campbell's going to be sitting in this chair next Tuesday. I think I'm going to have that as my ringtone, sitting in for Ian Dale, Alistair Campbell. So that's something to look forward to, and I can tell you I should be downloading the podcast of that the day after. And just to also tell you who's going to be on the book club over the next few weeks. Next Monday, we'll be joined in the studio by Lord Ashdown, Paddy Ashdown, and Sir Roderick Braithwaite. On the 28th of March, Peter Mandelson will be here, and on the 11th of April, and I'm so looking forward to this, Stephanie Powers, who people of a certain age will... Now, Toby, you're looking blankly when I say Stephanie Powers. You haven't got a clue,
Giving
have
you a blank radio look.
Heart to Heart. You'd never heard of Heart to Heart, and you live in America. There's no hope for you, really, is there? But anyway, you have written a very good book. It's called Dead Men Risen, The Welsh Guards and the Real Story of Britain's War in Afghanistan. Now, you build a picture in this book of a very much an undermanned and under-equipped battle group. How much resentment is there in Afghanistan among not just the Welsh Guards, but maybe more widely, about the fact that some of the equipment doesn't seem to be good enough, it doesn't arrive on time, there's undermanning?
Well, I think there's a lot of frustration. I mean, I think the recent history of the British in Helmand has always been, as General Richards actually has publicly admitted, and in the book has been playing catch up. And they arrived in the start of 2006 with about 3,300 troops. There's now 10,000 British troops there and 50,000 US Marines. Now, obviously, the Taliban has changed in that time, but it's always been a case of not quite enough men, too much area, and the equipment. I mean, when I was there, Rupert Thornlow was killed in a Viking. Sean Birchall, the company commander, was killed in a Jackal. I mean, these are vehicles that just cannot withstand the type of IEDs that the Taliban had. So, I mean, there was a fair degree of frustration and a feeling of being let down by politicians and generals.
It's interesting to say politicians and generals, because, of course, the politicians are the ones that take the flak, but it's the generals who put the equipment in there. But, Peter, when I don't know how much you can say about this, but when you were in Cabinet, presumably there were lots of discussions about the equipment and the staffing levels in Afghanistan. Was it a source of frustration to you that actually the defence ministers were taking advice from the generals and actually doing what the generals wanted?
Well, it was a source of I suppose, mystery that on the one hand you had all of the things that Toby's talking about and presumably are in your book, the frustrations that were being ventilated, and at the same time you were being told by whoever was the Defence Secretary on advice from officials that actually everything was okay. And there seemed to be a disjunction continually between the two. But then I thought that about the MOD in a number of ways. That I remember the deep cut scandal or the Gulf War syndrome, initially denied, and then subsequently dragged out of. The truth is dragged out, and I suspect there was something like that in this instance. I mean, the resources, the massive resources going into it, I mean, billions and billions of pounds, no doubt, like always, is never enough for anything in government spending. But there was always that disjunction.
I think one of the things is, I think it's very important not to let the armed services off the hook with this, because certainly within the army, one of the things that Rupert Thornlow felt and other officers tell me privately is that there's this sort of can-do culture from the generals and from the colonels and the brigadiers, and everybody's looking towards the next job. And you go out there as a brigadier in Helmand, and it's the culmination of your career. You're going to be there for 6 months. There've been 8 or 9 through. You win a DSO or you win a CBE, and it takes a very courageous person to say, you know what, Prime Minister, we can't do it. I mean, all the pressure is on you to say, we can do it. We haven't got quite enough. It's not ideal, but okay, we'll have a go. And at the lower level, I mean, that was one of the extraordinary things about Rupert Thornlow, is that he actually did say no. He said, Operation Panther's Claw. A few days before he died, he went to Brigadier Tim Radford and said, you know what, with the resources I've got, I cannot do it. And that was an extremely unusual thing to do. And I think it spoke to Thornlow's sort of self-confidence in that he knew or felt that he was good enough to be able to carry it off. But it was something that his men really revered him for, because they felt that he was putting A, the mission, and B, their welfare above his own career. And I think, the accusation could be laid at the feet of others that the career was often the top priority.
There's some amazing stories in the book, and one of them is the tales of the sniper men Tom Potter and Mark Osmond, who over 40 days killed 75 Taliban fighters, including 2 with just a single bullet. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, interestingly, that was one of the things the MOD was very uncomfortable about, the number of Taliban that were killed by the snipers. Which
why would they be uncomfortable about?
Well, who are the people who get all the glory and the medals these days? Bomb disposal people, because it's something that no one can argue with. You are defusing something that's intrinsically evil, and you're not hurting anybody, and it's the ultimate sort of selfless act. And those guys are incredibly incredibly brave.
One was killed last week, wasn't he?
That's right, and
amazing job they do.
Right, absolutely, and and no one would take anything away from them. But it's almost as if all the kind of the heroism and the medals and the sort of public relations aspect of this has been focused on those bomb disposal guys. The snipers, I think, are similar. They're different mentalities, but they're also a sort of a breed apart. And so, I went down to patrol base Shamal Storai, which is means North Star in Pashto, which is a remote sort of compound, and met these 2 guys, totally unexpected. They were in the Welsh Guards battle group. They were part of the 4 Rifles battalion, and just 2 extraordinary characters. And when they started, I was talking to them in their little hide, all camouflaged up and everything, and I looked at the beam above me, and there was ration packs with the Union flag on them, and then there were these little stick men in chalk, and I said, like, what are those? And he said, those are our kills. Every time we kill somebody, we put one up. Now I noticed that some of them didn't have a head, and I said, so what's that? He said, that's the head. That's the headshots. And then some of them were in blue and some of them were in white. And I said, why are some of those in blue? Oh, that's because we ran out of chalk. So, but this is, these are guys who are extremely focused, extremely skilled, and they're looking up close and personal at the damage they do. And you do wonder about the psychological burden that they have to carry as the years go on. But I mean, some kind of horrific things that they did, in a cause that they believed in. And in terms of counterinsurgency, what people will tell you is that the sniper is, one of the ultimate weapons, because it's assuming the shot is aimed at the right person. You can kill a person from, these days, more than a mile with no effect on the civilian population. If there's a suppressor on the rifle, people, won't even hear the shot. Very, very clinical. Obviously, much better than mortars, which can go astray, or 500-pound bombs which destroy property and civilians. So the story of the snipers in Helmand, I think, is really something else.
How can they see somebody at a mile away?
Well, very, very powerful scopes. I mean, the equipment they've got is incredible. I mean, there was the sniper in there. All these snipers, by the way, have got pseudonyms because they have killed so many people that you kind of publicise it, and somebody looks them up in the phone book, and they would be at risk. And but there was a guy who's named Fitzgerald in the book, who he killed 5 men in under a minute at a range, each of them more than a mile.
Well, that's Toby Harnden. He's written a book called Dead Men Risen, full of anecdotes like that. Peter Hain's written a book called Mandela, $12.99. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. This is LBC 97.3.
Dreaming of running your own business?